Colonel Tiburcio kicked the rotting wooden chest toward the old carpenter as a final insulting inheritance. The wood groaned under the colonel's polished boot, a sound of decay that matched the smirk on his face. He laughed while Bento, with his back bent and his hands scarred from 50 years of service, hauled the piece of trash away from the big house. Tiburcio's mistake was simple. He assumed the wood was as hollow as his own soul. He thought he was throwing away a piece of garbage, but that water-damaged jacaranda trunk held a secret compartment. Inside lay the one document that would strip the Tiburcio family of every single acre they owned, every horse they rode, and every brick of that plantation. What the masters didn't know was that the wood remembers, and Bento. He knew how to make it speak. The heat at Fazenda Tres Gameleras didn't just sit on you, it pushed you down. It was the kind of humid, heavy air that carried the smell of drying coffee beans and the bitter scent of the master's expensive cigars. Bento stood in the dirt of the main yard, staring at the chest. It was an ugly thing, darkened by dampness, covered in layers of dust and spiderwebs. To anyone else, it was firewood. To Donna Ismenia, the colonel's wife, it was a joke. She stood on the shaded veranda, fanning herself with a silk fan that cost more than a slave's life, watching Bento struggle with the weight. She didn't offer a word of kindness. She just laughed, a high, sharp sound that cut through the afternoon silence like a whip. Look at this. Some folks call this tradition, but it's just cruelty with a fancy name and a last name to match. The injustice didn't start with the trunk, though. It started 3 months ago, on the night the old master died. Old man Trajano wasn't a saint, but he was a man of his word. He had promised Bento his freedom. He'd even signed the manumission papers in front of the local priest. Bento had those papers tucked into his shirt, a piece of hope that kept his tired heart beating. But as soon as the old man's body was cold, Tiburcio stepped in. He didn't just take the keys to the plantation, he took Bento's future. In front of the entire household, Tiburcio took those papers, looked Bento in the eye and tossed them into the fireplace. He claimed they were fakes, forgeries. He told Bento that a man like him didn't deserve a name, let alone a piece of paper. He forced the old man back into the sun, back to the sores and the plains, despite the way his knees shook every time he stood up. Bento didn't argue. You don't argue with a man who holds a whip and the law in the same hand. He just watched the paper turn to ash. But Bento had spent 65 years watching people. He'd watched the old master's habits. He knew the way Trajano would disappear into his private workshop for hours, the sound of a fine chisel tapping against hard wood. He knew that the old man didn't trust his own son. Tiburcio was a gambler, a man drowning in debts to the crown, a man who looked at the plantation and saw only a pile of gold to be spent on wine and cards. The day the will was read was a performance of pure malice. The local notary sat in the dining room sweating through his collar, while Tiburcio and Ismenia waited to claim their prize. They expected the land, the cattle, and the gold. What they didn't expect was the specific mention of Bento. The notary read the words slowly. To my faithful carpenter Bento, I leave the old jacaranda trunk kept in the corner of my study. Tiburcio had turned red. He thought the old man was mocking him from the grave. He looked at the trunk, dirty, cracked, and smelling of the cellar, and decided to make the delivery as humiliating as possible. He didn't just give it to Bento, he kicked it into the mud. But as Bento gripped the iron handles to lift the chest, his fingers felt something the colonel's boots never could. He was a master carpenter. He knew the weight of jacaranda. He knew how it should feel when it's hollow, and how it should feel when it's solid. This trunk was too heavy, not by much, but enough to make a craftsman's pulse quicken. There was a density to the base that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't just the weight of old clothes or moldy books. It was the weight of a secret. The problem was that Bento wasn't alone. Tiburcio was watching him from the balcony, his eyes narrowed. The colonel was a nervous man, the kind who hides his fear behind a loud voice and a heavy hand. He'd been on edge ever since his father's funeral. Some said the old man died of a sudden fever. Others, the ones who whispered in the slave quarters, noticed the way the master's tea smelled of bitter almonds on his final night. Tiburcio wanted Bento gone, but he couldn't just kill him, not yet. He needed the old man to finish the repairs on the main gate, before the tax auditors arrived. "Move it, old man," Tiburcio shouted from above. "Unless you want me to help you move with the end of a lash." Bento didn't look up. He strained his muscles, the wood biting into his calloused palms. He dragged the chest toward his small shack near the edge of the woods. Every inch was a battle. The wheels of the master's carriage kicked up dust that coated Bento's throat, making him cough. He could hear the laughter of the house servants, who had already sold their souls to Tiburcio for an extra ration of flour. They didn't see a man carrying a legacy. They saw a fool carrying a piece of trash. When he finally reached the shadow of his shack, Bento was trembling. His granddaughter Mariana ran out to help him. She was 19, with the same sharp eyes as her grandfather. She worked in the big house, scrubbing floors and hearing things she wasn't supposed to hear. She knew the colonel was desperate. She knew he had been meeting with men in dark coats, men who came from the city to talk about unpaid balances and seizure of property. "Grandfather, why did you bring this here?" she whispered, looking back at the big house to make sure no one was following. "The colonel is in a foul mood. He's looking for any reason to punish us." Bento wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag. He looked at the trunk. In the dim light of the setting sun, the dark wood seemed to bleed a thick, dark resin. It looked like a wound. He touched the corner where the wood was most rotted. "The master didn't leave me garbage, Mariana," he said, his voice a low rasp. "He left me a message, but we have to be careful. If the colonel finds out what's inside before I do, we won't live to see the moon rise." That night, the plantation was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Bento sat on the dirt floor of his shack, a single candle flickering between him and the trunk. He had his tools laid out, the ones he'd hidden from the overseer over the years. A fine blade, a small hammer, and a steady hand. He began to clean the mud off the jacaranda. As the layers of filth came away, the true craftsmanship began to show. This wasn't a mass-produced piece. The grain was matched perfectly at the seams. It was a masterpiece of deception. He tapped the bottom of the trunk. It gave a dull, solid thud. He tapped the sides. Hollow. He moved his fingers along the base, searching for a seam, a knot that felt out of place, or a hidden spring. He knew the old master's style. Trajano loved puzzles. He loved things that required a specific sequence to open. Suddenly, a heavy silver tray crashed to the floor inside the big house, the sound echoing across the yard. Bento froze. He blew out the candle and waited in the darkness. Through the cracks in his shack's walls, he saw the lights in the master's office flickering. He heard Tiburcio's voice, raised in a drunken rage. The colonel was arguing with his mania. "The audit is in 3 days," Tiburcio screamed. "If we don't find the original ledger, the major will seize the entire estate. My father was a senile fool. He hid the records to spite me." Ismenia's voice was lower, but just as sharp. "The carpenter. He was always with your father. If anyone knows where the old man kept his private books, it's him. Why did you give him that chest? What if it's in there?" Bento's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then that the rotten trunk wasn't just an insult. It was a gamble Tiburcio had lost without even knowing the stakes. The colonel thought he was being clever, giving Bento the trash to show his dominance. But now the realization was setting in. "I'll burn it," Tiburcio growled. "I'll go down there tomorrow morning and I'll chop that piece of wood into splinters myself. If the ledger is in there, it goes to hell with the old man." Bento knew he didn't have until morning. He had hours, maybe less. He relit the candle, his hands shaking. He had to find the mechanism. He had to see what was inside before the colonel's axe found the wood. He pressed a small, raised knot near the left handle. Nothing. He tried the right side. Nothing. He began to feel a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. Was he wrong? Was it just a heavy piece of wood after all? Then he remembered something. The old master always wore a specific ring, a heavy silver band with a square seal. When he worked in his shop, he would often tap that ring against the wood as he thought. Tap, tap, slide. It was a rhythm. Bento took his small hammer and mimicked the sound on the base of the trunk. Tap, tap, slide. For a second there was only silence. Then a sharp metallic click echoed in the small room. A thin line appeared along the bottom edge of the trunk, a seam so fine it was invisible to the naked eye. The false bottom began to shift. But as it did, the smell of the wood changed. It wasn't just rot anymore. It was the sharp, unmistakable scent of something chemical, something that didn't belong in a carpenter's shop. Bento pulled the panel back an inch, and his eyes widened. He didn't see gold. He didn't see jewels. He saw a leather-bound book, its edges stained with moisture, and next to it a small glass vial filled with a clear, oily liquid. He reached for the book, but a shadow crossed the window of his shack. Someone was outside. Someone was watching. The floorboards of the porch creaked under a heavy weight. Bento blew out the candle, but the smell of the snuffed wick lingered in the air, a dead giveaway. He stayed perfectly still, his hand hovering over the secret compartment, as the latch on his door began to turn. The master's greed had led him to throw away his own destruction, but he was starting to wake up. And a man like Tiburcio, when he wakes up to his own stupidity, becomes the most dangerous animal on the plantation. Bento looked at the open trunk, then at the door. The hunt had begun, and the prize was a truth that could set 1,000 people free, or get them all buried in the same hole. The latch on the door didn't just turn. It groaned, a slow, agonizing sound that felt like a blade scraping against Bento's nerves. He didn't have time to hide the trunk under the bed. He didn't have time to flee. He did the only thing a man who has lived 65 years in the shadow of the whip knows how to do. He became a statue. He shoved the leather ledger and the small glass vial back into the false bottom and slammed the panel shut just as the door swung open. The click of the spring was loud in the silence of the shack, but it was drowned out by the heavy footfall of Silvano, the plantation's overseer. Silvano was a man made of muscle and malice. He didn't need a reason to be cruel. He just needed an audience. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the moonlight, the smell of cheap tobacco and sweat filling the small room. He held a lantern high, its yellow light dancing over the dirt floor and settling on the jacaranda trunk. He looked at Bento, who was sitting in the corner, his breathing shallow, his hands tucked into his lap to hide the grease from the trunk's mechanism. "What are you doing in the dark, old man?" Silvano asked. His voice was like gravel being crushed. "The master said you were supposed to be sleeping, not playing with your inheritance." Bento didn't look him in the eye. That was a mistake younger men made. "I was just checking the wood, sir. It's rotting. I didn't want the termites to move into my floorboards. Look at this. Some people think power is built on stone and titles, but usually it's just built on a pile of lies waiting to rot." Silvano walked over to the trunk and kicked it. The sound was different now. To Bento's trained ears, the thud was muffled by the ledger inside, but Silvano was too dull to notice. He just saw a piece of junk. He spat on the wood, the saliva dark against the deep grain of the jacaranda. "The colonel wants this trash gone by tomorrow. He says it's an eyesore. He told me to tell you to chop it for firewood, every single piece. If I see one splinter of this trunk left by sunset tomorrow, it's your back that'll be providing the heat for the big house. Do you understand me?" Bento nodded, his heart sinking. Firewood. If he chopped the trunk, the ledger would be destroyed. The proof of Tiburcio's debt, the evidence of how the old master really died, it would all go up in smoke. And with it, Bento's only chance at freedom and justice for his granddaughter. Silvano didn't wait for a reply. He laughed a short, ugly sound and walked out, leaving the door hanging open. Bento sat there for a long time, listening to the overseer's footsteps fade into the distance. His mind was racing. He needed a plan. He looked at the trunk. In the pale moonlight, the wood seemed to be sweating. That dark resin he had noticed earlier was oozing from the cracks, and it had a strange, bitter smell. It wasn't the smell of nature. It was the smell of the master's last night. Bento realized then that the vial he had found wasn't just a secret. It was a weapon. If he could prove that the liquid in that vial matched what killed old man Trajano, Tiburcio wouldn't just lose the plantation. He'd lose his head. But how do you fight a colonel when you are a piece of property? How do you keep a piece of wood when the man who owns the land wants it burned? The next morning the sun rose red and angry over the coffee fields. Bento was already at work, but he wasn't chopping the jacaranda. He was in the tool shed, his hands moving with a frantic precision, He had found an old discarded cedar chest in the scrap pile, a piece of junk that looked vaguely like the jacaranda trunk if you didn't look too closely. He spent the early hours of the morning staining it with coffee grounds and mud, trying to match the dark, weathered look of the original. Mariana appeared at the door of the shed, her face pale. She had been working in the kitchen, and her eyes were red from the smoke and the fear. "Grandfather, the colonel is coming," she whispered. "He's in a rage. He found out that the tax auditor, Major Cavalcanti, is arriving a day early. He's looking for the ledger everywhere. He's tearing the big house apart." Bento looked at the decoy chest. It was a poor imitation, but in the harsh light of the yard it might pass. "Help me, Mariana," he said. "We have to swap them. We have to hide the real trunk in the Ribeirão das Almas. The mud by the creek will keep the wood from drying out and cracking, and the thickets are too dense for the horses to go through." "But the overseer is watching the yard," Mariana protested. "If he sees us carrying anything toward the creek, he'll know." "Then we don't carry it," Bento said, his voice hard. "We use the cart. Tell him the master ordered the trash to be dumped in the ravine. If you don't have a stomach for the way the rich trample the poor in the dark, subscribe. And tell me, this hidden compartment, was it a gift from the dead or a trap for the living?" Mariana hesitated, then nodded. She was a brave girl, but the risk was staggering. If they were caught, there would be no trial. Tiburcio would have them hung from the old Gamilera tree before the sun reached its peak. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was a lifetime of silence, watching the man who murdered his own father walk away with everything. They moved quickly. Bento loaded the decoy chest onto the small handcart, covering it with old sacks and branches. He kept the real jacaranda trunk hidden behind a pile of lumber in the back of the shed. Just as they were about to move, the sound of boots echoed on the gravel. Colonel Tiburcio appeared, his face flushed and his clothes disheveled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. He held a riding crop in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He walked straight into the shed, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. "Where is it?" he demanded. Bento stood his ground, his back straight despite the ache in his spine. "The firewood, sir. I was just taking it to the ravine to dump the rot." Tiburcio walked over to the cart and ripped away the sacks. He looked at the decoy chest. He didn't see the different grain. He didn't see the hurried staining. He only saw the shape of his father's legacy. He kicked the side of the cedar box, and the cheap wood splintered. "Rotten," Tiburcio hissed, "just like the old man. Burn it. I want to see the smoke from the veranda. I want to know that every memory of that senile fool is turning to ash." He turned his gaze to Bento, his eyes cold and predatory. "And you, old man, if I find out you've been hiding anything, if I find one page of those records, I'll make sure you wish you'd died with him." Tiburcio turned and stormed out, leaving a cloud of tension behind him. Bento waited until the footsteps vanished, then he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He looked at Mariana. They had survived the first wave, but the real danger was just beginning. The decoy was in the yard, but the real trunk, the one with the poison and the truth, was still in the shed. And then he heard it, the sound of Silvano's voice calling out to the other guards. They were searching the slave quarters. They weren't just looking for the ledger. They were looking for anything that didn't belong. The colonel wasn't just angry, he was paranoid. He knew his father's habits as well as Bento did, and he was starting to realize that the old man wouldn't have left a rotten trunk to a carpenter for no reason. Bento grabbed the real jacaranda trunk. It felt heavier than ever, as if the secrets inside were gaining mass. He and Mariana began to move toward the back of the shed, toward the narrow path that led down to the creek. But as they reached the edge of the woods, a branch snapped behind them. Bento didn't turn around. He knew that sound. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. Someone had stayed behind. Someone was watching them from the shadows of the big house, and as the first curls of smoke from the decoy chest began to rise into the sky, Bento realized that the master's eyes were everywhere. The trap was closing and the creek was a long, long way away. The shadow didn't move, but the silence did. It grew thick and suffocating. Bento gripped the iron handle of the real jacaranda trunk so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. Beside him, Mariana was a statue of terror, her breath hitched in her throat. Slowly, out of the darkness of the tool shed's overhang, stepped a figure. It wasn't the overseer, it wasn't the colonel. It was a young boy, no older than 12, with eyes too large for his thin face. It was Zay, the stable boy. He looked at the trunk, then at Bento, and then back toward the big house where the orange glow of the decoy fire was licking the night sky. "The overseer is coming back," the boy whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "He found a piece of the other box that didn't burn. He knows the wood is wrong. He's telling the colonel right now." Bento didn't hesitate. He didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. He shoved the heavy trunk into the boy's arms. "Help us, Zay. If they find this, we're all dead. Not just me, all of us." The boy hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. He knew the cruelty of Colonel Tiburcio better than anyone. He carried the scars of a riding crop across his shoulders to prove it. Together, the three of them vanished into the thick undergrowth behind the shed, moving toward the Ribeirão das Almas. The creek was a place of ghosts and mud, where the water ran black under the canopy of ancient trees. It was the only place where the hounds couldn't follow the scent, and the only place where the earth was soft enough to swallow a secret. The path was a nightmare of tangled vines and sharp thorns. Every step felt like a mile. Bento's heart was a drum in his chest, a frantic, uneven rhythm that threatened to stop at any moment. He could hear the distant shouting from the big house, the sound of a man who had realized he'd been played for a fool. Tiburcio's rage was a physical thing, a heat that seemed to follow them through the woods. When they reached the banks of the creek, the smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant water hit them. Bento found a spot where the roots of an old fig tree clawed into the mud like a giant's hand. "Here," he gasped. They lowered the trunk into the shallow, murky water. The jacaranda didn't float. It sank into the silt, the dark resin bleeding into the current like ink. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe to the channel. And tell me, was this hidden ledger a message of hope? Or a death warrant for everyone who touched it? Bento pushed the trunk deeper into the mud, covering it with heavy stones and rotting branches. His hands were covered in filth, the black soil of the plantation under his fingernails. He looked at the water and felt a wave of cold realization. He was 65 years old. He had spent his life building houses for men who hated him, carving furniture for women who wouldn't look him in the eye. He was tired, so very tired. But as he looked at Mariana and Zay, he saw the future. He saw a world where they wouldn't have to hide in the mud just to hold on to the truth. "Go back," Bento ordered, his voice cracking. "Go back and act like you've been sleeping. If they find you out here, there's no saving you. What about you, grandfather?" Mariana grabbed his arm, her eyes filling with tears. "I have to meet the Major," Bento said. "He arrives at dawn. If I'm not there to tell him where to look, Tiburcio will kill him too. A man who poisons his own father won't hesitate to kill a tax collector." The problem was that the Major wasn't coming at dawn anymore. As Bento climbed back up the ridge toward the plantation, he heard the heavy rumble of a carriage. It wasn't the light buggy of a local visitor. It was the iron-rimmed wheels of a crown transport, escorted by 4 armed riders. Major Cavalcanti had arrived 12 hours early. The plantation exploded into a frenzy of activity. Torches were lit, illuminating the yard in a harsh, flickering glare. Bento watched from the edge of the woods as the carriage door opened. A man stepped out, tall and stiff, wearing a coat the color of a winter sky. Major Cavalcanti didn't look like a man who enjoyed the heat. He looked like a man who lived for numbers, for facts, and for the cold letter of the law. Colonel Tiburcio was there to meet him, his shirt half unbuttoned, his face a mask of sweating desperation. "Major, we didn't expect you until tomorrow. Please, come inside. The heat is unbearable tonight." "The heat is irrelevant, Colonel," the Major replied, his voice clipping every word like a pair of shears. "My orders are to begin the audit immediately. There are discrepancies in your father's final filings, discrepancies that suggest a significant amount of missing capital." Tiburcio laughed, but it was a hollow, terrifying sound. "My father was an old man, Major. He lost his mind toward the end. The records are a mess. We had a fire just an hour ago, a small accident in the shed. Some old papers were lost." Bento felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Tiburcio was already building his lie. He was going to claim the ledger was burned in the fire he'd ordered Bento to set. If the Major believed him, the audit would end before it began, and the plantation, along with everyone on it, would remain in Tiburcio's blood-stained hands. But then the Major paused. He looked toward the smouldering remains of the decoy chest in the yard. He walked over to it, his boots crunching on the embers. He reached down and picked up a piece of the wood that hadn't fully turned to ash. He held it up to the light of a torch. "Cedar," the Major said quietly. Tiburcio froze. I beg your pardon?" "This wood," the Major said, turning the charred fragment in his gloved hand. "It's cedar, cheap, common cedar. Your father's personal study was famously panelled in jacaranda. His private chest, the one mentioned in the Crown's registry, was also jacaranda. Why would your important records be kept in a box of scrap cedar, Colonel?" The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it would crack the earth. Tiburcio's eyes darted toward the tool shed, then toward the woods where Bento was hiding. The Colonel's hand went to the hilt of the small knife he kept at his belt. He was a cornered rat now, and a cornered rat doesn't negotiate. "The old man," Tiburcio hissed, his voice low enough only for the Major and his guards to hear. "The carpenter must have swapped them. He's a thief. I'll have him found. I'll have him broken until he tells me where the real wood is." Bento knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to get to the creek. He had to get the real trunk before Tiburcio's men reached it. But as he turned to run, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, expecting the overseer, but instead he found himself looking into the cold, calculated eyes of one of the Major's guards. "The Major wants to speak with the carpenter," the guard said. "Now." Bento was led into the light of the torches, his clothes covered in mud, his face scratched by thorns. He looked like a madman or a criminal. Tiburcio's face lit up with a cruel triumph. "There he is!" the Colonel shouted. "The thief! Major, this is the man who stole my father's property. He's been hiding it in the woods. Look at him. He's covered in the very filth of his crime." The Major looked at Bento. He didn't see a slave. He didn't see a thief. He saw a witness. He walked up to Bento, the smell of expensive soap and old parchment clashing with the stench of the creek. "Where is the jacaranda trunk, old man?" Bento looked at the Major, then at Tiburcio, who was making a subtle cutting motion across his throat with his hand. The threat was clear. If Bento spoke, Mariana would pay the price. If he stayed silent, the truth would die in the mud. But then Bento remembered the small glass vial, the clear liquid that smelled like bitter almonds. He remembered the way the old master had looked on his final night, his eyes bulging, his breath coming in gasps that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in the wood. "The trunk is where the dead go to wash their sins, Major," Bento said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "But the wood isn't just carrying papers, it's carrying a ghost, and that ghost has a very specific smell." The Major's eyes narrowed. "What smell?" "The smell of almonds," Bento whispered. The color drained from Tiburcio's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He lunged forward, his riding crop raised to strike, but the Major's guards stepped in his way, their rifles leveled at his chest. The game had changed. The audit was no longer about money, it was about blood. And as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the coming rain, the secrets of Fazenda Tres Gameleras were finally starting to rise to the surface. The word almonds hung in the humid air like a death sentence. Major Cavalcanti didn't move, but his eyes turned into flint. In the world of high-ranking officials and silent assassinations, that scent meant only one thing: cyanide. It was a clean way to kill, a quick way to steal a legacy, and a signature of a man who thought he was too smart to be caught. Tiburcio's face didn't just lose color, it turned a sickly, bruised gray. He began to stammer, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them behind his back. "The old man is senile," Tiburcio barked, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "He's been breathing sawdust and wood glue for too long. Major, you cannot take the word of a slave over a man of my standing. He's trying to save himself from the theft of that chest by spinning fairy tales." But the Major wasn't listening to the Colonel's status. He was looking at the way Bento stood, tired, muddy, but unshakable. There is a specific kind of stillness that comes to a man who has nothing left to lose, and the Major recognized it. He turned to his lead guard, a man with a scarred cheek and a cold gaze. "Take 3 men. Follow the carpenter to the creek. If there is a trunk in that mud, I want it on this table within the hour. And if anyone tries to stop you, use whatever force is necessary." The problem was that the sky finally broke. A flash of lightning ripped through the darkness, followed immediately by a roar of thunder that shook the foundations of the big house. The rain came down in a solid wall of water, the kind of tropical deluge that turns paths into rivers and creeks into killing zones. Bento felt a surge of panic. If the Ribeirão das Almas rose too fast, the jacaranda trunk wouldn't just be hidden, it would be gone, buried under tons of silt, or swept miles downstream into the deep ravines. As they began the descent toward the creek, the mud became a trap. Every step was a gamble. The guards struggled with their heavy boots and rifles, cursing the darkness. Bento led them by memory, his fingers tracing the bark of the trees he had known for decades. But what nobody knew was that Silvano, the overseer, hadn't stayed at the big house. He had slipped away into the brush the moment the Major gave the order. Silvano knew the woods better than the soldiers, and he had a head start. The thing is, fear makes a man fast, but greed makes him desperate. Silvano wasn't just working for Tiburcio anymore, he was working for his own life. He knew that if that ledger was found, he'd be the first one the colonel would sacrifice to the gallows. If you don't engole this type of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And me Diz, this proof, the almond-scented vial, was it a message or a sentence? Down at the creek, the water was already rising, a churning black mass of foam and debris. Bento reached the old fig tree, his heart leaping into his throat. The branches he had used to cover the trunk were gone, swept away by the current. He lunged into the knee-deep mud, his hands clawing at the earth where he had buried the secret. The guards stood on the bank, their lanterns flickering in the wind, casting long, distorted shadows against the trees. "I don't see anything but mud, old man," one of the guards shouted over the roar of the rain. "If you're lying to us, the colonel will be the least of your worries." Bento didn't answer. He felt something hard beneath the silt. A corner, an iron handle. He pulled with all his remaining strength, his muscles screaming in protest. The mud groaned, a wet sucking sound as the jacaranda trunk finally broke the surface. But as he gripped the wood, a shot rang out. The bullet whistled past Bento's ear, thudding into the trunk of the fig tree. The guards scrambled for cover, their lanterns falling into the mud. From the darkness of the opposite bank, the flash of another muzzle-loader illuminated the face of Silvano. He was perched behind a rock, his eyes wild, reloading his rifle with frantic movements. "Leave it," Silvano screamed through the storm. "Leave the wood or you all die in this hole." The guards returned fire, the cracks of their rifles lost in the thunder. Bento stayed low, his body shielding the trunk. He could feel the vibration of the water hitting the wood. He realized then that the secret inside wasn't just a ledger. It was a weight that had been crushing his soul for 65 years. He felt an internal monologue of rage, a lifetime of being told he was nothing, of being a tool for men like Tiburcio. He wasn't going to let the mud take this. He wasn't going to let a bullet end it. "Pull it up," Bento roared at the guards, "unless you want to explain to the Major why you let the evidence wash away." 2 of the guards, moved by the sheer authority in the old man's voice, rushed into the water. They grabbed the handles and began to haul the heavy chest toward the ridge. Silvano fired again, hitting one of the soldiers in the shoulder, but the other guard leveled his rifle and fired a clean shot. A cry of pain echoed from the opposite bank, followed by the sound of a body tumbling through the brush and into the rushing water. Silvano was gone, taken by the very creek he had tried to use as a shield. But the victory was short-lived. As they reached the top of the ridge, Bento saw the lights of the big house flickering. A new sound was rising above the rain, the sound of horses. Many horses. Tiburcio hadn't stayed behind to wait for the Major's justice. He had called in his debts from the local militia, men who owed him money, men who lived outside the law. The turning point came when Bento realized the Major's carriage was being surrounded. Tiburcio was planning a massacre. He was going to kill the Major, the guards, and Bento, and then blame the whole thing on a slave uprising fueled by the storm. It was a desperate, bloody gamble, but in these remote lands, the man with the most guns usually wrote the history books. Bento looked at the mud-stained trunk in his hands. He knew the mechanism. He knew how to open it. But he also knew that once that lid was up, there was no going back. The truth would be out in the air as thick and suffocating as the smell of almonds. He looked at the guards, who were now checking their ammunition, their faces grim. "The Major is in danger," Bento said, his voice cold and sharp. "And the only way to save him is to show him what's inside this wood before the Colonel's men finish their work." They began to run toward the big house, the heavy jacaranda trunk between them like a coffin they were carrying to a funeral. But it wasn't Bento's funeral they were heading for. The wood remembers, and tonight it was finally going to speak. Bento burst into the main hall, a ghost made of mud and cold rage. The militia had their rifles aimed at the Major's chest, but everything stopped when the old man slammed the waterlogged jacaranda trunk onto the mahogany table. Tiburcio's face went white, his eyes bulging. "Shoot him!" the colonel shrieked, his voice cracking. "He's a thief and a liar!" But nobody moved. The authority in Bento's scarred hands was stronger than any whip. Tap, slide. The wood groaned and the hidden panel clicked open. The sharp, suffocating smell of bitter almonds hit the room like a physical blow. Major Cavalcanti reached into the secret compartment and pulled out the leather-bound ledger and the half-empty vial of poison. He opened the book to the final page, where the old master had scrawled a desperate, dying confession. It named Tiburcio as his murderer and detailed every cent of the debt hidden from the crown. The militia lowered their guns. They were greedy men, but they weren't fools. They wouldn't die for a man whose head was already in the gallows. Tiburcio tried to run, tripping over his own boots as he scrambled for the veranda, but the Major's guards were faster. They tackled him into the mud, the same filth where he had kicked the trunk only days before. He was shackled like a common criminal, his screams of "I'm the master" fading into the roar of the storm. Donna Ismenia was dragged from the house by the tax auditors, her silk dress torn and her pride shattered. She was left on the road with nothing but the rags of her vanity. The crown seized the lands, but the Major did one last thing. He honored the original manumission papers found tucked inside the ledger. Bento and Mariana were finally free. They were given a small plot of land by the creek, a place where the wood grows tall and the secrets are finally at peace. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And comment, do you think someone there knew everything? Or did everyone choose to pretend? The colonel thought he was throwing away trash. Instead, he handed the keys of his own prison to the man he oppressed. Greed always leaves a trail for those who know how to look. The wood remembers.